They said draining a pool was a crime. The cop who showed up took one look at Corinne's face, then looked at me and said, "Sir, I think we're done here." But that was after 3 weeks of harassment, two false reports, and one very expensive mistake Corinne made that she still hasn't recovered from. My name is Garrett Fowler. I am 43 years old, a licensed plumber and pool contractor with 21 years of experience, and I have lived in the Maple Crest HOA community in central Tennessee for 6 years. My wife Dana and I bought our house specifically because it had a large backyard and an in-ground pool that the previous owners had installed in 2009. The pool was 16 feet by 32 feet, a concrete gunite built with a deep end of 8 feet, and when we moved in it was in decent shape but not great. The plaster was chalking, the returns were corroded, and the equipment pad had a filter that belonged in a museum. We knew going in that we would eventually need to do a full renovation. We saved for it. We planned for it. And in the spring of last year we were finally ready. The renovation I had planned was not a small job. Full drain and acid wash, replaster with a quartz finish, new tile at the waterline, replace all the returns and skimmers, install a new variable speed pump and a saltwater chlorination system, red all the coping, and resurface the surrounding deck with cool deck coating. Total cost around $31,000. I was doing the project management myself and pulling the permits personally because I hold an active contractor's license in Tennessee and I know exactly how this process works. I had been through it dozens of times on other people's pools. I knew every step, every inspection, every requirement. I filed the permit application on a Tuesday morning, paid the fee, and had approval in hand by Thursday afternoon. The permit was posted on my fence gate before the first drop of water left the pool. That is not optional. That is not a courtesy. That is the law, and I follow the law, and I have followed the law in every project I have ever done because that is what separates a professional from someone playing pretend. I scheduled the drain for a Saturday in late April. I had already contacted the city utilities department 2 weeks prior because Tennessee, like most states, has specific rules about how pool water can be discharged. You cannot simply pump 40,000 gallons of chlorinated water into the street storm drain. You have to dechlorinate first, test the pH, and in our municipality, you are required to discharge slowly into the sanitary sewer cleanout or into a vegetated area on your own property if the volume is manageable. I had a dechlorination plan, a discharge plan, a timeline, and written correspondence with the utilities department confirming my method was approved. I kept all of it in a folder on my kitchen counter because I am the kind of person who keeps folders. Saturday morning I started the pump at 7. The discharge hose ran along the side of my house to the cleanout access at the back of the property. Slow drain, controlled, exactly as planned. I was outside monitoring it when my neighbor from 3 houses down, a woman named Patricia Weller, walked past on the sidewalk with her 2 dogs. Patricia was 61, recently retired from a career in pharmaceutical sales, and had moved to Maple Crest 4 years ago with what appeared to be a mission to turn a quiet neighborhood into a managed resort property. She had already gotten 2 families cited for paint colors she personally found offensive. She had submitted a 17-page document to the HOA board, requesting that basketball hoops be banned from driveways because they, and I am quoting directly from the document which was read aloud at a meeting I attended, created an atmosphere inconsistent with the aesthetic dignity of Maple Crest. Patricia stopped on the sidewalk and looked at my setup, the pump running, the hose, the water moving. She had a specific look she used when she was deciding whether something was worth her time. Lips slightly pursed, head tilted, one hand on the leash and the other at her hip. I had seen that look before and it never led anywhere good. "Good morning, Patricia," I said. She did not say good morning back. She said, "What are you doing to that pool?" "Draining it for renovation," I said. "Permitted and approved." She looked at the hose. "Where is that water going?" Sanitary sewer cleanout at the back of the property. Approved by city utilities. She looked at me the way people look at you when they have already decided you are lying and are just waiting for you to finish talking. Then she walked on without another word. Her smaller dog looked back at me as they rounded the corner. Even the dog seemed suspicious. I did not think much of it. I had my permit. I had my approvals. I had my documentation. I was doing everything correctly, and I knew I was doing everything correctly, and that knowledge felt solid under my feet, the way good concrete feels solid, weight-bearing, dependable. The drain took most of the day. By 4 in the afternoon, the pool was empty, the equipment shut down, and I was standing in the shallow end looking at 14 years of plaster that needed to come off. There was calcium scaling along the water line, some delamination near the main drain, and a hairline crack in the east wall that I had suspected for 2 years and now could see clearly. It felt satisfying in the way that opening something up always feels satisfying when you have been waiting to see what is inside. Dana brought out 2 beers and we sat on the coping and looked at the empty shell of the pool in the late afternoon light and talked about the quartz finish color we had chosen, a soft gray-blue called Coastal Mist, and how the new deck surface was going to make the whole backyard feel completely different. It was a good afternoon. Monday morning, the first letter arrived. It was on HOA letterhead, which Patricia happened to have access to because she was the HOA communications chairperson, a volunteer position she had campaigned for 18 months ago with what I can only describe as alarming enthusiasm. The letter informed me that I had been observed conducting unauthorized pool drainage operations in violation of Maple Crest HOA Community Standards Section 7, Subsection 4, which prohibited exterior construction and modification activities without prior board approval. I read it twice. Then I read Section 7, Subsection 4 of the CC&RS, which I had in a binder on my shelf because I bought a house in an HOA and I read the documents before I signed them. Section 7, Subsection 4 covered structural modifications to the exterior of the home. It said nothing about pools. It said nothing about drainage. It referenced fences, additions, and outbuildings, which a pool is none of. I wrote a response that same day. Polite, specific, cited the CC&RS directly. Attached a copy of my permit and the utilities approval letter, and noted that the activity in question did not fall under the scope of Section 7, Subsection 4, by any reasonable reading of that provision. I emailed it to the HOA management company, copied the board president, a retired accountant named Howard Gillespie who I had always found reasonable, and kept a copy for my folder. Howard called me that evening. "Garrett," he said, "I think there may have been some miscommunication here. I appreciate you sending the documentation. I am going to review this with the full board and get back to you by the end of the week." That sounded fine. That sounded like a reasonable process working the way a reasonable process should work. I thanked him and went back to preparing for the acid wash scheduled for Wednesday. Patricia was not finished. Tuesday afternoon, a code enforcement officer named Dale Prute showed up at my door. Dale was a city employee, mid-40s, the kind of tired that comes from years of fielding complaints about things that turn out not to be violations. He had a clipboard and the expression of a man who already knew this was going to be one of those visits. Received a complaint about improper pool water discharge, he said. Potential environmental violation. I invited him in, offered him coffee, and put the folder on the kitchen table. I walked him through everything. The permit, the utilities correspondence, the dechlorination log I had kept, time-stamped with pH readings every 2 hours during the drain, the approval confirmation from the utilities department with the inspector's name and direct phone number. Dale looked at everything. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Who filed this complaint?" I said I had a strong suspicion but no proof. He wrote something on his clipboard. "This is fully compliant," he said. "I will note that in my report, I am sorry for the inconvenience. I told him there was no inconvenience and meant it. He was doing his job, and the complaint had come from someone else. I walked him out and called Howard Gillespie immediately to let him know a code enforcement visit had occurred and resulted in full clearance. Howard sounded embarrassed. I will address this, he said. Wednesday, the acid wash team came. I supervised, as I always do on my own property. The work took 6 hours. The pool looked entirely different afterward, clean white concrete ready for plaster, the old surface stripped back to fresh material. I took photographs at every stage because documentation is a habit I cannot turn off. Thursday morning, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. Not a letter, not HOA letterhead, just a piece of paper folded once. It said, "Your construction is disturbing the peace of this community and will not be tolerated." No signature. The handwriting was looping and precise, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who was praised for it in school and never forgot. I photographed the note, added it to the folder, and called my plaster crew to confirm their Friday start date. Friday, the plaster crew arrived at 7:30. 3 men, professional equipment, the kind of operation that runs clean and fast because they have done it hundreds of times. My neighbor directly behind me, a man named Carl Beasley who had lived in Maple Crest for 11 years, leaned over the fence to watch for a few minutes and said it looked like real craftsmanship. Carl was an engineer and not given to casual compliments. I appreciated it. The plaster application took the better part of the day. By 4 in the afternoon, the pool had its new quartz finish, a smooth gray-blue that caught the light exactly the way the sample card had suggested it would. We started the fill that evening. Slow fill, controlled, city water through the hose bib with a fill rate I had calculated to avoid thermal shock to the new plaster surface. Saturday morning, I came outside to check the fill level and found Patricia Weller standing on the sidewalk in front of my house with her phone raised, filming. I walked to the edge of my driveway. "Can I help you, Patricia?" "I am documenting," she said, without lowering the phone. "Documenting what exactly?" "Your ongoing violations." "I have no violations. Code enforcement cleared the drain. The permit covers the renovation. Everything happening here is legal and approved." She lowered the phone slightly. "The HOA has not approved this project." "The HOA does not have jurisdiction over this project under the CC&RS," I said. "I have sent documentation to the board. Howard Gillespie has that documentation." "The board has not yet ruled," she said. "The board has not yet ruled on something that is not within its authority to rule on," I said. Her jaw tightened. "We will see about that." She walked away. I went inside and called Bill Morrow, a real estate attorney I had used twice before on property matters, not because I was worried, but because I believe in being prepared before a situation requires preparation rather than after. Bill listened to the full timeline, asked 4 specific questions, and said she has no case. The CC&RS do not cover this activity. The permit is valid. The utilities clearance is documented. If the HOA attempts to fine you, you dispute it in writing citing specific provisions, and if they escalate, you have grounds for a harassment claim. Keep documenting everything. I was already documenting everything. The following Tuesday was the regular monthly HOA board meeting. I attended. The community room at the clubhouse held about 60 people, and on a normal month drew maybe 12. That night there were 31. Word had gotten around that something was happening, and people in HOA communities have a finely tuned antenna for conflict. Patricia sat in the front row with a manila folder on her lap and the focused energy of someone who had been rehearsing. Howard called the meeting to order and worked through the standard agenda items with the efficiency of a man who wanted to get to the uncomfortable part and passed it as quickly as possible. Under new business, Patricia stood without being called on and said she wished to raise a matter of urgent community concern. Howard recognized her with the expression of a man who knew this was coming and had made peace with it. Patricia presented what she called evidence of ongoing violations at the property of Garrett Fowler. She had printed photographs from her phone. She had printed a section of the CC and RS with certain passages highlighted in yellow. She had a prepared statement that she read from, and she read it in the tone of someone delivering a verdict rather than raising a concern. When she finished, I raised my hand. Howard recognized me. I walked to the front of the room with my folder. I placed a copy of the permit on the table, a copy of the utilities approval, a copy of Dale Pruitt's clearance report, a copy of the CC and RS with Section 7, Subsection 4 highlighted, along with the 3 sections that followed it, which together made absolutely clear that the provision covered structural additions to the home's exterior and had no application to pool maintenance or renovation, and a copy of Bill Morrow's written legal opinion, prepared that afternoon, stating that any HOA fine issued in connection with this project would constitute an improper exercise of authority and would be subject to legal challenge. The room was quiet. Howard looked at the documents for a long moment. Then he looked at Patricia. Then he looked at me. "Patricia," he said carefully, "I think we need to table this matter for the board to review fully before taking any action." Patricia stood up. "This community deserves protection from people who think the rules do not apply to them." I said with as much patience as I had available, "Patricia, I followed every rule that applies. City Code, State Environmental Regulation, HOACC and RS, every single one. What I did not do was ask your personal permission, and that is not a rule." Several people in the room made sounds of agreement. Patricia sat down. Howard moved on. I drove home feeling steady. The pool was filling properly. The project was on schedule. My documentation was complete, and I had a legal opinion in writing. What I did not anticipate was that Patricia was not done. Not even close. She had escalated before and been turned back, and it had not stopped her. Each time she ran into a wall, she did not conclude that she was wrong. She concluded that she needed a different angle. The angle she found next was the one that brought a police car to my driveway on a Thursday afternoon. She called the non-emergency line and reported that I was illegally discharging contaminated water into the municipal storm system, and that the discharge had been ongoing for days and was causing environmental damage. The pool had been filling for 5 days at that point. There was no discharge. There was no hose connected to any drain. There was water going in, not coming out, because that is how filling a pool works. The officer who responded was named Sergeant Ray Callahan. He was somewhere around 50, with the composed manner of someone who has seen enough false calls to spot one before he gets out of the car. He pulled into my driveway, got out, and looked at the backyard through the gate I opened for him. He saw a pool filling with water. He saw a hose connected to a hose bib on the house. He saw no discharge equipment of any kind. He looked at me. He looked at the pool. He looked back at me. "Sir," he said, "I think we are done here." I showed him the folder anyway because I had it, and because I believe in being thorough. He looked through it with the attentiveness of someone who appreciated seeing a civilian this organized. He made a note of the utilities clearance case number and the permit number, said he would include them in his report, and thanked me for my time. As he was walking back to his car, Patricia appeared on the sidewalk. She had been watching from down the street. She walked toward us with purpose and asked Sergeant Callahan what action he was taking. He turned to her with the careful neutrality of a man who has handled this type of situation many times. "Ma'am," he said, "there is no violation here. The homeowner has valid permits and documented city approval for all drainage activity. The pool is currently filling, not draining. There is nothing to act on." Patricia said, "I want to file a formal complaint." "You are welcome to do that at the station," he said. "But I want to be clear that filing a false police report is itself a violation, and the documentation this homeowner has provided is thorough. He got in his car and drove away. Patricia stood on the sidewalk for a moment looking at me. She opened her mouth and then closed it. Then she turned and walked back down the street. I went inside and told Dana what had happened. She had heard the car and come to the kitchen window. She said, "Is it over?" "No," I said, "but it is getting there." I called Bill Morrow that evening and told him about the police call. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a false report to a law enforcement officer. Combined with the ongoing pattern of HOA letters and the code enforcement complaint, you have the components of a harassment case. I want to send a formal cease and desist to Patricia Weller personally and to the HOA board." "Send it," I said. The letter went out the following Monday. It was 4 pages, detailed, and cited every incident by date with corresponding documentation. It put Patricia on formal notice that continued harassment would result in legal action, including claims for intentional interference with a property owner's rights, filing false reports, and abuse of HOA process. It was copied to Howard Gillespie and to every member of the HOA board. Howard called me within 2 hours of receiving it. "Garrett," he said, "I want you to know the board is taking this seriously. We are going to have a formal conversation with Patricia about her conduct. I also want to tell you that we reviewed the CC and RS thoroughly, and the board is in agreement that your renovation project does not require HOA approval. You will be receiving a letter to that effect today." The letter arrived by email that afternoon. Official board determination, signed by all 5 members, stating that the pool renovation at my property was outside the scope of HOA authority under the existing CC and RS, and that no fines or citations related to this project would be issued. I printed it and put it in the folder. The pool finished filling on a Friday. I spent the weekend balancing the chemistry, running the new variable speed pump through its programming cycles, and watching the saltwater system come online for the first time. The quartz finish had cured perfectly. The coastal mist color was everything the sample card had promised. The new deck surface was clean and cool underfoot even in the afternoon sun. Carl Beasley leaned over the back fence Saturday afternoon while I was checking the chemistry readings. "Looks beautiful," he said. 14 years that pool waited for this," I said. "Worth the wait," he said, "worth it." Dana swam in it Sunday morning. First swim. She came in from outside with wet hair and said, "It is the best pool I have ever been in, and I have been in a lot of pools." I believed her. I built it right. That is what you get when you build something right. The fallout from the cease and desist letter moved faster than I expected. The following Thursday, the HOA board held a special session. I was not invited, but Howard called me afterward with a summary. The board had formally reviewed Patricia's conduct over the preceding 3 weeks. They had looked at the letter she had sent on HOA letterhead, the code enforcement complaint, the police report, and a pattern of prior complaints she had filed against other homeowners that the board now viewed in a different light. Patricia was removed as communications chairperson by a 4-to-1 vote. The one dissenting vote was her own, because her position on the board as a committee chair gave her a vote in the matter, and she exercised it, which the rest of the board found telling. She was notified in writing and asked to return the HOA letterhead templates she had been provided access to. She sent a 6-page response to the board disputing the decision. Howard told me it was detailed and impassioned and referenced Robert's Rules of Order 17 times. The board noted it and took no further action. 2 weeks later, my attorney received a letter from Patricia's personal attorney, suggesting that the cease and desist had caused Patricia emotional distress, and that she was considering a defamation claim based on the characterization of her complaints as harassment. Bill Morrow called me when he received it. He was using the voice he used when something amused him, but he was keeping it professional. "Their theory," he said, is that calling documented false reports to law enforcement and code enforcement by the term harassment is defamatory. What does the law say about that? I asked. The law says truth is an absolute defense to defamation, he said. Her attorney knows that. This letter is a pressure tactic, not a real threat. I will respond accordingly. His response was 2 paragraphs. It cited the police report number, the code enforcement clearance number, and the HOA board determination, and it noted that any defamation claim would be met with a counterclaim for malicious prosecution and abuse of process. It invited Patricia's attorney to proceed if they wished. We did not hear from Patricia's attorney again. The summer was quiet in the way that summers are supposed to be quiet. The pool got used. Dana's sister visited for a week in July and spent most of it in the water. The neighbor kids from 2 houses down asked politely if they could swim one afternoon, and we said yes and watched 4 children spend 3 hours doing cannonballs off the coping and screaming with the particular joy that belongs to summer and cold water and having nowhere important to be. It was a good afternoon. Patricia's house went on the market in August. The listing appeared on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday people in the neighborhood were talking about it. The listing price was $14,000 below the average comparable sale in Maple Crest, which suggested some degree of motivation. The house sold in 11 days. I do not know where she moved. I did not ask. What I do know is that at the September HOA meeting, Howard Gillespie proposed 3 amendments to the CC and RS. First, a provision requiring that any HOA enforcement action be reviewed by the full board before any letter is sent to a homeowner. Second, a provision explicitly clarifying that pool maintenance, repair, and renovation are not subject to HOA approval so long as valid permits are obtained from the relevant municipal authority. Third, a provision establishing that any HOA committee member who files a false complaint against a homeowner, confirmed as false by a regulatory or law enforcement body, is subject to immediate removal from their position. All 3 amendments passed unanimously. Howard looked at me across the room when the third one passed. I gave him a nod. He gave me one back. The pool, that September evening when I got home from the meeting, was lit by the underwater lights I had installed as part of the renovation. Soft blue-white light coming up through the coastal mist finish, the water still, the surface catching the last of the daylight. Dana was sitting on the new deck with a glass of wine. She said, "How did the meeting go?" I said, "Good, everything is good now." She said, "Sit down. The pool looks beautiful tonight." I sat down. The pool did look beautiful. It had looked beautiful all summer, and it was going to keep looking beautiful because we had done the work correctly, documented everything properly, followed every rule that applied, and refused to be moved by someone who confused her preferences with authority. That is the thing about knowing what you are doing. It is not arrogance. It is preparation. It is 21 years of showing up on time, pulling the permits, keeping the folder, and understanding that the rules are not your enemy when you actually follow them. The rules were on my side every single day of that process. Patricia had the letterhead and the committee title and the certainty that she was right. I had the permit, the documentation, the attorney, and the patience to wait for each layer of her campaign to collapse under its own weight. They collapsed one by one. The HOA letter, the code enforcement complaint, the police call, the attempted bribe of the cease and desist threat. Each one fell when it met the folder. The folder never got heavy enough to be inconvenient and never got light enough to feel insufficient. It was exactly what it needed to be, and so was I. Dana refilled her wine and asked if I wanted anything. I said a beer would be good. She went inside and came back with 2, and we sat there in the September evening watching the pool lights play against the water and said very little because there was not much left to say. Everything was exactly as it should be. The pool was right. The neighborhood was right. The documentation was filed. The amendments were passed. The committee chair was gone. and somewhere out there a house in Maplecrest had sold to someone who would hopefully find the community worth what they paid for it. I finished the beer. The pool was still. The lights held steady in the water. The coastal mist finish looked in that light like something worth waiting 6 years for. It was,